HOA Karen calls 911 on me, but the cops were already waiting for her. Hey there, storytellers. Globe showing America's, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Tractor Sparkles. If you enjoyed this wild HOA showdown, you won't believe what's coming next. Trust me, tomorrow's story is even crazier. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Loudspeaker bell. And while you're here, tell me, have you ever dealt with a nosy neighbor like Karen? Let's chat in the comments. Speaking head, backhand, index pointing down. Jack had always known that life on a farm wasn't for everyone, but for him, it was everything. At 45 years old, he was the proud owner of a 100-acre farm in Texas, passed down through 3 generations. His grandfather had built the barn with his own 2 hands, and his father had expanded the orchards that now stretched across the rolling hills. Jack had spent his entire life working the land, tending to livestock, and preserving the traditions that made his family farm special. But times were changing. Over the years, more and more farmland had been sold off to developers, making way for pristine suburban neighborhoods. Cookie-cutter houses lined up in perfect rows, each with a carefully manicured lawn and identical white fences. And with these new homes came the dreaded Homeowners Association, better known as the HOA, a group dedicated to enforcing rules about everything from mailbox colors to acceptable shades of flowers. Jack didn't mind the new neighbors. He figured they'd keep to themselves, and he'd keep to his farm. But then came Karen. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. At around 55 years old, she had made it her personal mission to ensure that every inch of the neighborhood met her impossible standards. Unfortunately for Jack, she viewed his farm as an eyesore, even though it had been there long before her subdivision existed. The sight of his big red barn, his grazing cows, and the occasional bray of his donkey seemed to drive her mad. From the moment she moved in, Karen made her opinions clear. She would stand at the edge of her property, arms crossed, watching Jack as if he were some sort of criminal. She complained about the smell of fresh manure, the sound of the rooster crowing at dawn, and even the way his orchard ruined the aesthetic of the neighborhood. She sent letters, stopped by unannounced, and even tried to convince other HOA members that Jack's farm was bringing down their property values. But the biggest problem? Jack's farm wasn't part of the HOA. His land was completely separate, meaning their rules didn't apply to him. And that drove Karen crazy. One day, after weeks of passive-aggressive comments, Karen finally snapped. She stormed up to Jack's property, waving a piece of paper in her hand, a cease and desist letter from the HOA, demanding that he fix the nuisance smell coming from his compost pile. Jack couldn't help but laugh. He invited Karen to take a tour of the farm, to see how the composting system actually worked, but she refused. "We have standards," she sniffed, turning on her heel and marching back toward her house, heels clicking like a judge's gavel. Jack shook his head, watching her go. He had dealt with stubborn people before, but something told him Karen wasn't done yet. Little did he know, the real battle was just beginning. And this time, Karen was about to make a mistake she couldn't take back. Jack wasn't the type to let nonsense get to him. He'd dealt with bad weather, stubborn livestock, and the occasional broken tractor, problems that actually mattered. But Karen? She was a different kind of storm, one that had no intention of passing anytime soon. After her failed attempt to intimidate him with the HOA's cease and desist letter, Jack figured she'd cool off. Maybe she'd finally accept the fact that his farm wasn't part of her perfect little neighborhood and move on. But no. Karen didn't back down. If anything, she doubled down. Over the next few days, Jack noticed her more than usual. She lurked near the property line, scribbling furiously in a notepad like she was gathering evidence for some kind of trial. Every time he glanced her way, she'd snap her head down, pretending to be busy, but he knew better. She was watching. Waiting. Then, the complaints started rolling in. Jack received an official notice from the county about a possible health violation on his property. The claim? That his compost pile was producing an unbearable stench that was negatively impacting nearby residents. He had to laugh. His compost system was one of the most eco-friendly setups in the region, designed to break down organic material naturally with zero harmful runoff. But he knew exactly who was behind it. Karen wasn't content with just complaining to him. She wanted to get the authorities involved. And when that didn't work fast enough for her, she escalated. 2 days later, as Jack was checking the fence line near his orchard, he heard the familiar screech of Karen's voice cutting through the morning air. "There you are," she snapped, stomping toward him in a pair of impractical high heels. "I've had enough of this. The HOA will not tolerate this blatant disregard for community standards." Jack exhaled slowly, keeping his patience in check. "Karen, for the last time, I'm not part of your HOA." She smirked, holding up another piece of paper, this time, an official-looking letter from her lawyer. "Oh, but that doesn't mean we can't take legal action. You're disturbing the peace with those animals of yours, and don't even get me started on the rooster. I've been kept awake for weeks." Jack crossed his arms. "Karen, you moved in next to a farm. What did you expect?" Her face twisted in frustration, and she pointed a perfectly manicured finger at him. "You just wait. You're about to get a visit from the sheriff." Jack arched a brow. Now that was new. "Oh yeah?" "Oh, absolutely," she said, crossing her arms triumphantly. "I've already reported you. And when they get here, we'll see how untouchable you really are." Jack should have been annoyed. Maybe even worried. But instead, he just smiled. Because what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly realize, was that the sheriff was already scheduled to visit the next morning. Not for Jack. For her. Jack wasn't the kind of man who lost sleep over petty drama, but Karen's latest stunt was starting to get on his nerves. She had actually called the sheriff on him, over a compost pile, a few farm animals, and the sound of a rooster doing what roosters do. It was laughable. But the funniest part? The sheriff wasn't coming for him. Jack had suspected for weeks that something was wrong with the creek that ran through his property. The water had started looking murky, and his irrigation system was showing signs of contamination. At first, he thought it might be natural, maybe seasonal runoff or a buildup of organic material. But then he talked to some neighbors upstream, and they had noticed the same thing. So Jack did what any responsible landowner would do. He called the county environmental department. They ran tests and found dangerously high levels of chemicals in the water. The source? Likely from fertilizer runoff coming from the pristine, overly landscaped yards of the HOA community next door. And who was in charge of landscaping decisions for the HOA? Karen. The county had launched an investigation, and the sheriff's office was already involved. In fact, Deputy Reynolds was scheduled to stop by Jack's farm the next morning to collect more water samples and discuss the situation further. So when Karen smugly told Jack to expect a visit from the sheriff, he had to bite his tongue to keep from laughing. She thought she was sicking the law on him, when in reality, she was about to walk straight into her own trap. The next morning, Jack was up before dawn, like always. He fed the chickens, checked on the goats, and made sure his donkey, Peanut, was in a good mood, which mostly involved giving him a few extra treats. By the time 8 a.m. rolled around, Deputy Reynolds was pulling up in his patrol car, stepping out with a clipboard and a small water testing kit. Jack greeted him with a nod. "Morning, Deputy." "Morning, Jack," the deputy replied. "Let's get that water sample and see what we're dealing with." As they made their way toward the creek, Jack heard it, the unmistakable sound of an engine revving furiously. He turned just in time to see Karen's SUV come to a screeching stop at the edge of their property line. She practically jumped out, phone in hand, eyes wild with indignation. "I'm calling 911, she shouted, pointing a finger straight at Jack. "Right now." Jack glanced at Deputy Reynolds, who raised an amused eyebrow but said nothing. Karen tapped frantically at her phone screen. Within seconds, her voice rang out loud and clear as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity on my neighbor's farmland. I think he's illegally dumping waste." Jack folded his arms, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. Deputy Reynolds let her go on for a few more seconds before he finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I'm already here investigating illegal dumping," he said, holding up his water sample container. "But not because of Jack." Karen's face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean?" Deputy Reynolds tucked his notepad under his arm and met her gaze. "The real investigation," he said, "is about chemical runoff coming from your property." For the first time since Jack had met her, Karen had nothing to say. For the first time since Jack had met her, Karen was speechless. She stood frozen, phone still clutched in her hand, as Deputy Reynolds calmly explained that the real investigation wasn't about Jack's farm, it was about the illegal chemical runoff coming from her HOA's pristine, over-manicured lawns. Jack watched as her brain worked overtime, trying to process the reality she had just walked into. She had stormed onto his land, screaming about suspicious activity, thinking she was about to get him in trouble. But in her rush to play enforcer, she hadn't even considered the possibility that she was the one being investigated. And the situation was about to get even worse for her. Before Karen could stammer out a defense, a second patrol car pulled up. Deputy Garcia, a younger officer Jack had met before, stepped out and took in the scene. His eyes flicked from Jack to Karen, then to Deputy Reynolds, before nodding in understanding. "Well," Garcia said, pulling out his notepad, "looks like we got here just in time." Karen, still reeling, pointed at Jack again, her voice high and desperate. "You don't understand. He has animals everywhere. There's compost, manure, who knows what kind of filth is getting into that water." Jack finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's funny, Karen, because I've been running water tests for the past month. I've got logs, photos, and official reports. And guess what? The contamination isn't coming from my farm." Deputy Reynolds nodded. "Jack's farm is actually in compliance with county regulations. But we have strong evidence that excessive chemical fertilizers and pesticides from your HOA are seeping into the creek." He held up a sealed water sample. "We're running tests, but the initial findings don't look good." Karen's face turned bright red. She turned to Garcia, looking for backup. "This is ridiculous. My HOA follows strict landscaping rules. We have standards." Garcia sighed, flipping through his notes. "Ma'am, county environmental laws override HOA guidelines. Just because you want the neighborhood to look like a country club doesn't mean you can ignore the law." Karen's expression darkened. "This is a conspiracy," she hissed. "It's him." She jabbed her finger toward Jack. He's behind all of this. He's trying to ruin our community. Jack let out a dry laugh. Karen, I just want to run my farm in peace. You're the one who called 911 on me. You're the one being investigated. Maybe it's time you take a step back. Before Karen could explode again, the situation escalated even further. A third vehicle, a sleek, unmarked black sedan, rolled onto the property. Out stepped a tall man in a suit, his badge clipped to his belt. Detective Morris. He specialized in environmental crimes. Karen's breath hitched. Jack could see the panic creeping in. She had come here expecting to take him down, but instead, she had walked straight into the biggest mess of her life. And it wasn't over yet. Karen's face went pale as Detective Morris approached. This wasn't just a couple of deputies writing up a complaint, this was a full-blown investigation. The unmarked car, the official documents, the calm but firm demeanor of the detective, it all screamed serious. Jack crossed his arms and leaned against the fence, watching as Karen squirmed. Detective Morris pulled a sleek leather folder from under his arm, flipping it open as he addressed Karen. Miss Karen, we have records of large-scale chemical purchases tied to your HOA, specifically fertilizers and pesticides exceeding state limits. These chemicals have been found in the waterway running behind your property. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for a way out. That's not possible, she snapped. I signed off on landscaping budgets, not environmental violations. If anyone's to blame, it's Trudeau, our landscaper. He's the one who applied the chemicals. Morris didn't flinch. We've already spoken to Mr. Trudeau, he said, turning a page in his folder. He claims he was instructed by the HOA board to use these chemicals, despite county regulations. He gave her a pointed look. And your signature is on the purchase orders. Jack could almost hear the gears turning in Karen's head as she desperately tried to spin the situation in her favor. You can't be serious, she said, her voice cracking. This is all based on some water tests? That's hardly proof of a crime. Detective Morris held up the sample container. It's enough to warrant a full investigation. And if further testing confirms the source, your HOA, and you, could be facing fines or worse. Karen clenched her fists. This is harassment, she shrieked, turning back to Jack. This is your doing. You and your filthy farm. If you'd just follow the HOA's guidelines like everyone else, none of this would be happening. Jack finally pushed off the fence and took a step forward. Karen, I don't follow your rules because I don't have to, he said calmly. This farm was here long before your HOA, and it'll be here long after you're done throwing tantrums. You tried to force me into your little suburban fantasy, but it backfired. And now? You're the one under investigation. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She looked to the deputies, then to Detective Morris, then back to Jack. Then, as if grasping at one final, desperate straw, she hissed, I'll sue you. I'll sue you all. Detective Morris sighed, snapping his folder shut. You're welcome to consult an attorney, he said. But right now, we need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. The fight drained from Karen's face. She knew she was beaten. Without another word, she turned and stomped toward her driveway, phone already pressed to her ear. Jack watched as she disappeared inside her house. He knew this wasn't the last he'd hear from Karen, but for now, the farm was peaceful once again. Judy stepped onto the porch and smiled at him. Your dad would be proud, she said softly. Jack glanced out at the orchard, at the land his family had worked for generations. Yeah, he said. I think so too. Wow, what a wild ride. Tractor fire, can you believe Karen actually called 911 on herself? Talk about instant karma. But let's hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor like Karen, someone who thinks they run the entire neighborhood? Maybe you've had an HOA nightmare of your own? Tell me your stories in the comments. I love reading them, and who knows, your experience might even inspire a future video. Also, let me know where you're watching from. Globe showing Americas. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Are you tuning in from a big city or a quiet countryside like Jack's farm? Drop your location in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Police car light eyes. Now, go ahead, let's chat in the comments. Down arrow speech balloon.